So why did I decide to do this study? Because I think there's just kind of been a lot of back and forth as to like what the nature of, I guess, what we used to call the alt-right, but now the alt-right has kind of fallen apart, so we kind of call it the dissident right now. And there's always been like a lot of debate. Like, is it primarily Christian? Is it primarily pagan? Is it secular? There's going to be this. There's a lot of different diversity of opinion as to what the whole thing is. So what I thought is what I would do is I go through and see if we could actually figure this out. As you guys know, I have my undergraduate is in political science, particularly with regards to um, empirical analysis of politics. So I have some background doing this. In political science, you have to take multiple social science courses that include stuff like research design. So I do actually have a bit of formal training in this area. So I did a whole bunch of research and looked at other stuff. And if you've been following me on Discord or YouTube creator interaction or any of that kind of thing, I have been going through and surveying people and getting them to like say, what is it that you guys want? What questions you think are important? What questions do you think matter? That sort of thing. We'll start in a minute. I'm just giving a bit of background while I give people a minute to show up. While So I don't normally do this, but there is a donation link to my PayPal below. This did take up a lot of time. I mean, obviously, I don't do this for the money. But if anybody appreciates the effort and would like to throw me a couple bucks, be my guest. So, yeah, feel free to do that. That's down there. I also just added, if you scroll down below that, just refresh the page. I have the PowerPoint presentation we're about to look at, and I also have some tables that have like everything cross-tabbed. So feel free to download those if you want to do your own video or you want to do your own analysis. Feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm perfectly happy with that. Just please give me a shout out. Link to my channel, maybe link to this video. I'm okay with you using the results however you want to use them. I just like some credit because, like I said, this did take quite a bit of time and stuff to get through this. So that being said, let's begin with. So I did do a study like this last year. So last year I covered some different topics. I know as I'm going through this, people are going to get angry and they're going to say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? All that kind of thing. And that's just kind of the nature of research. There's only so many questions you can ask. Like, I didn't want to go more than like 15 or 16 plus demos because I think that it would just take too much time. And there's always a certain number of questions. Like last time I asked about gay marriage and abortion and that kind of thing, and there was a very strong feelings towards that. So I didn't think there was really a need to cover it again. So take a sip of my Perrier and let's look at it. Okay, so standard methodology statement. This study was conducted through online surveys between August 18th and August 30th among 2,095 respondents. Now, I actually got another like 90 respondents after this, It's just going through and coding everything and running all this takes a while. So if people really want me to go back and do some like additional stuff with this, I'm happy to do that. There just kind of has to be a bit of a demand for it, that sort of thing. So yeah. Um, and I just like to give a shout out to some people who helped me out with this. The data distributists. Oh, I misspelled it. I said data distributism. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a professional, but he did this on stream. I sent him an advance copy of this. Serp Kerp, aka formerly known as Nazbol Grang, Earl of Grey, Endeavor, and Charlemagne. Wow, I should have proofread this. Oh well, we're just gonna move on from that. I shouldn't have heard Early of Grey. I'll have to update that later on. So then, let's start off. So how this basically worked is I asked the various people on this list to maybe do a video of them taking the study, and then ask their followers to go through it. So. Also, Millennial Woe shared this. I'm not sure if Ramsey Paul shared this, but I emailed it to him and he said it was a good study and he filled it out. So demographics, unsurprising, we have males 94%, females 5%, and 1% other. Now, I'm going to have to confess for this one, I had to kind of alter it because so many people asked me to add in an other category. So for something like 60 to 70% of the study, I didn't have a category for other. So there's a couple people who said gender non-binary. There's a couple people who put troll responses, and I tended to code those out. But there was, I think, just enough for other to be its own category. And then we have age. So it's good to know I'm not a groomer. I think as people expected, this movement's pretty young. So the vast majority of people we surveyed were 18 to 34. So basically millennials and Zoomers. And I combined everybody who's over 35 and under 18. So there was not a particularly large portion. Pretty much everybody's in that age range. And I don't think that surprises anyone who's kind of been in these circles for a very long amount of time. Okay, so region and ethnicity. Sorry, not religion, ethnicity. So we got 55% North American, which I think is unsurprising because the dissident right is kind of predominantly a North American phenomenon. Because a substantially large portion of it is white identity, and white identity is very much kind of a North American or a settler concept. In Europe, I think it does exist to a certain extent, but it's more you're a French nationalist or a German nationalist or a Hungarian nationalist or something like that rather than being white or something like that. But there is a substantial Western European majority, and then there was basically like nobody else. So obviously, overwhelmingly, everybody, or most of the people are white. Most of the mixed race put mestizo down. Pretty much all of them. So education and employment. So this is a standard thing they ask on most studies, just to kind of group stuff together. And this was a particular interest because you have like the whole neat sock meme, and you have the whole like people in these circles are losers or they don't have any future. So I found out very few people were actually formally meet the definition of neat. Like, there's only 3% who formally meet the definition of neat. And I think some of those were, I didn't initially have an other category. I just forgot to put it in. But once I added it in, some people put self-employed, retired, parent, disabled, that kind of thing. So really about like 1 to 3% of people were actually NEETs. A very small percentage. Given the age demographic, it's not surprising that the plurality were attending school, and then lots of people were either employed full time or part time. I don't consider people who are looking for work to be NEETs. I don't think that's fair. So, group is also pretty well educated. We have a fair number of postgraduates, people who have post secondary, people who are currently in school, in technical school. So, overall, you have about 2/3 of people. 2/3 of people have post secondary education. I'm not sure exactly how that compares against the general population, but that's pretty high. Part of the reason there's only 20 that there's such a high number without post secondary, I think, is in part that um, let's see here, how young a lot of the people are. So there's that. Okay, so that's just kind of some basic demographics. I find that stuff all interesting. If you look at the Excel file I uploaded in the description below, I have every question cross-tabbed by everything. So if you want to see how people with different employment statuses responded to all the questions, feel free to download that in and take a look at it. So, religion. I don't think this is going to be particularly surprising, but about just over 2/3 of the people who responded were Christian, either Protestant, Orthodox, other Christian, or Roman Catholic. So Roman Catholics are obviously by far the biggest category, being over 1/3. Then agnostic or atheist is actually quite high as well. I collapsed some of these categories later on, and I had to remove some of them. But yeah, so this was something some people complained about. Just an issue I always come across whenever somebody's doing something like this is Anglicans are never really sure where to put themselves. So a lot of them will put other because they consider themselves Protestant and Catholic. So they'll put something down. Other Christian is normally non-denominational, evangelical. I'm assuming Mormons put other Christian, something like that. It's just people who don't identify as one of the three main branches. Mormons, if people put Mormon and other, I just recode it as other because I don't consider it to be a Christian denomination. But I'm sure a lot of Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses put that down. Paganism and neo-paganism is a tiny group. That's pretty much always the case. They're just very vocal. I think a lot of them are agnostic or atheists who are nationalists who appreciate that. Philosophical theism was things like deism, Platonism. Other theists is probably another way of doing it. Then we have secular. Secular was defined as people who are not religious but don't actively disbelieve. And then I had 1% Jewish and no Muslims. Okay, so here we go. Political ideology. Now, I had some things in brackets after this, but I removed that. I removed that just so this would all fit on one thing. So the predominant over a third listed traditionalism or traditionalists. So under that I had like monarchist, traditionalist, reactionary, all that sort of thing. I think that's fairly straightforward. So third position was something that people complained about, because under third position I had like fascism, National Bolshevism, National Socialism, right-wing socialism. What else was there? Any kind of nationalism. And some people complained about this because they said if you're a Southern nationalist, you might be a conservative, or you might be very small government, and it's not really third position. I find, though, that there's a tendency of people in these circles, a lot of people will just put down their political ideology as nationalism, and they won't really qualify it. So if anyone put down nationalist in the other category, I just recoded them as third position. Broadly right wing is what I put down personally, and that's just people who don't know if they necessarily fall into a. By the way, none of these are mutually exclusive. You can be a traditionalist and a nationalist. This is just kind of getting an idea of how people identify themselves, just at kind of an immediate level. So broadly right wing was for people who aren't really sure. People who maybe they're like, I'm a someone proprietarians are recoded as broadly right wing. Also people who put like special snowflake ideologies down, like if people put down I'm a futurist, I'm a monarchical futurist or something like that, or I'm a proprietarian, or anything kind of weird like that, like if they wrote a long answer. Accelerationism I also put under broadly right wing. Then we had conservatives. So I had in like brackets national conservative, social conservative, liberal conservative, all that sort of thing. Then we had libertarian, which was also not that fairly large. And then we had a couple various left-wing ideologies. So that's interesting. So here's the one I think everybody has been super excited about. And this is really what took the longest amount of time, because a lot of people wrote me lengthy descriptions. There was a couple people who wrote, are you dumb enough to think that people are going to be honest on this? And people clearly were honest on this. So, just under half the people have suffered from some form of mental illness or developmental disability at some point in their lives. Nearly a third have suffered from anxiety and or depression, which is fascinating. And I'm not sure if I was expecting it to be that high or to be higher or what I was really looking out for, but that's a very interesting number. And I broke down political ideology by mental illness later on. So we do have a substantial number of people with learning disabilities, so ADD or ADHD or something else like that. The autism thing, I think, is... Let me just look up what the percentage of autism is in the general population. Okay, so the autism rate in the general population is 1.7%. So the autism rate here is over 5 times the... Let me see, what is that? 11 divided by 1.7. Okay, so it's 6.5 times the national average. So the autism thing, it's not as extreme as what people thought it would be, but it is much higher than the general population. So there's definitely some truth to the whole autistic right, or like autistic nationalism. Substance abuse was, I don't really know. if that's high or low. I think that's probably low. Bipolar, psychotic, personality disorders, etc. So that's interesting. So once again, the question was, have you ever suffered from or been diagnosed with any of the following? So there we go. Okay, so political ideology broken down by religion. I'm sorry if these graphs are a bit confusing to read. I really couldn't come up with a better way to present something with this much data. So this is really interesting. I'm sure this is kind of, to a certain extent, what people expected. So Christians are, generally speaking, more traditionalist than non-Christians. In particular, Roman Catholics and Orthodox, a majority identified with traditionalism as being their political ideology. For the sake of this, I excluded a lot of the smaller ones. So that's interesting. Paganism and neo-paganism was 66% third position, or in other words, 66% fascist, which once again I think is something we were all expecting, but it's interesting that it's that high. Now, philosophical theism is also interesting because you have a lot of esoteric people, so a lot of them are traditionalists, but a lot of them are also fascist. So that's kind of interesting. And then among the non-religious people, you had the highest proportion of libertarians. There is more conservatives. It's interesting that conservatism is so high among Protestants. My guess is just because it's kind of a thing, a cultural thing, to identify as a conservative if you're Protestant. But I think this is pretty interesting. So once again, this presentation and the tables that go with it are down in the description. They're on my Google Drive. Feel free to download them if you want to use them in your own reporting or your own presentation. Go ahead. Just please link to my channel and give me a credit for it. Okay, so economic ideology. So this is actually based, last time I asked people to write me like a sentence description of what their economic ideology was. What their economic ideology was. So I came up with these categories based on that. And I went back and I used these for this one. I also had another category, so I recoded people. Right. So laissez-faire. Some people took issue with ideal economy. For a lot of these questions, kind of what I was going for was they were a little ambiguous on purpose. I was just kind of looking for how people identified and how they identified with it personally. And their interpretation is fine, whether they meant in now or theoretically or however. So laissez-faire, I described it as little or no state regulation. So you might have the like contracts enforced, you might have fraud laws, you would have courts, stuff like that, but nothing really extensive. So it's not necessarily complete anarcho-capitalism, but just very little state intervention. And I think once again this is pretty unsurprising. Libertarians overwhelmingly liked the laissez-faire. Conservatives also liked it, and broadly right-wing also liked it. So that's nothing really surprising. So regulated market economy is basically what we have now. I described it as a capitalist or market economy with things like maybe protectionism or worker regulations, just kind of a mostly free market economy that has a significant amount of state intervention. So I think that makes sense. That's basically what we have now. A state directed market economy is something like China or Japan or something like mercantilism. It's basically, or it's just like market socialism. It's something where there's still a market economy, but the state owns large portion of it. A centrally planned or command economy is a communist state. A religious or traditional economy is a very awkward or ambiguous. Someone says Franco for state directed market economy. Yeah, that's how most fascist economics tend to work. They generally aren't centrally planned, but there isn't the same division between state and economy that you see in some other things. So, religious or traditional economy, I said distributism, some sort of economy based on Christian values, Sharia. I'm gonna have to do some research into Sharia compliant financing because it's a very interesting concept, and I could see Christians coming up with something kind of similar to it, but that's neither here nor there. And then post-industrial is things like advanced technology, automation, computers, all that kind of stuff. So that's interesting. Once again, I think the results are pretty neat so far. So all of the questions are broken down by religion and by political ideology. So next one we have economics broken down by um, religion. So unsurprisingly, Orthodox and Catholics picked traditional economy and then regulated market economy. To be fair, regulated market economy was the first or second for most of them. Protestants, interestingly, were more laissez-faire. Once again, I think it might just be kind of an American thing, because a lot of like very conservative Protestants who would be involved in these circles are from the South, and so they probably tend to be more free market and that kind of thing. Let's see here. Pagans are not actually as state directed as I thought. Kind of an interesting mixture across the board. Generally speaking, most people felt that capitalism or a market economy was good. You just need some sort of regulations on it. Okay, hope for the future. How hopeful are you regarding the future? So this was once again kind of a deliberately vague question. Like if people wanted to interpret this, their personally, society wide, their country, every country, their race, their religion, however people wanted to interpret that. So people were pretty black pilled. Over half were not very hopeful or had no hope whatsoever. Generally speaking, it was fairly similar across the board. Um, I don't really see looking at this any like huge difference between the different groups. Generally speaking, people are not very hopeful about the future. So let's scroll down. We have religion. Let's see which religions are the most black pilled. Paganism and neo-paganism was by far the most black pilled. Most of the Christians were black pilled. Yeah. If this doesn't really make sense from an average standpoint, it's because I took out some of these. So I don't think there's too much to say about this, other than the fact that people are pretty upset. Okay, so this was kind of a fun question. A lot of people wanted me to talk about aesthetics in this one. they wanted me to say there's a lot of different variations of this. Like some people wanted me to ask, should traditional architecture be Spark Schmidt asked, did you compare this data via sex cohort or demographic region? Yeah, most of that is in the Excel file that's down in the description. It has a more extensive breakdown, so feel free to download that and take a peek at it. Let's see here. So, yeah, so I wasn't really sure what to go with this. So I thought maybe the best way of doing this was just to ask people what their favorite Western architectural era was, as kind of a way of doing that. And once again, this is kind of a very vague question, but it is what it is. So classical slash neoclassical, because you have revival forms of it. Byzantine or Eastern European, medieval, which I included, Romanesque, Gothic. I forget what else. I have the survey open. Let me just scroll down and see what I put for that. Gothic, Neo-Gothic, Neo-Romanesque. Early modern is Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, Tudor. Modern is Art Deco, International, Futurism, and then postmodern is Googie or Brutalism. I'm going to be honest, it's not my favorite, but I do actually like Art Deco quite a bit. Um, so, generally speaking, people like medieval, followed by early modern. Traditionalists actually didn't like classical artwork more than the average person, which I find is funny. They actually liked it less. They liked medieval more, um, which I thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, generally speaking, people liked medieval architecture. Libertarians liked classical a bit more, maybe because they like the Fountainhead. I don't know. It's interesting though. Third position was a bit higher for modern. So then we have favorite architectural era by religion. So we have this is actually very interesting. So Roman Catholics, of course, said medieval because medieval is basically Roman Catholic architecture, but Byzantine architecture did very well with the Orthodox. Keep in mind, though, these are Orthodox who aren't from Eastern Europe. Um, there's only like 8% of people who did this survey that were from Eastern Europe. So probably most of the Orthodox are from North America. But they were true to their roots. They liked the Byzantine, and they didn't like medieval. They were the only group who didn't choose medieval as their kind of plurality. That's interesting. Protestants had somewhat more varied, but not too dissimilar. Other Christians basically the same. Philosophical theism liked modern more. I don't know. That's really weird. Pagan and neo-pagan like classical. Once again, interesting, about what you'd expect, but fascinating all the same. Accelerationism. Looking back on it, I probably didn't word this question very well, but this was kind of like a big topical thing with the Yang Gang. This is kind of an ever-present debate whether or not we should try for accelerationism. So, what is your position regarding accelerationism? The current situation is salvageable and accelerationism is unnecessary. The current situation is unsalvageable, but acceleration is immoral and or will not make things better. The current situation is unsalvageable and acceleration is a moral and effective way of addressing it. So less than a quarter of people actually supported it. Actually supported accelerationism. Most people were black-pilled, but they didn't think accelerationism was really the way out. The only group where significant people supported it were the third position or the fascist. So that's interesting. But that's about one would expect. But conservatives and libertarians were were a bit more white-pilled on this thing. Traditionalists were very deeply black-pilled, but they were also standing by their guns. So religion, interesting breakdown. Neo-pagans are fully on board with accelerationism. See, I like this. This is good. It's good that we got this like variety of results. If it had have come out and everybody was the same, this would have been really bad. But we got a really good range of results. So generally speaking, Christians were against accelerationism, and neo-pagans were supportive of it. Okay, freedom of speech, another interesting question. This was one I had no idea whatsoever the outcome would be. So we had a couple different things here. We had freedom of speech is an unalienable human right and cannot be infringed. Freedom of speech is a good thing, but there are limits. It depends whether or not you think that pornography or things like that would fall under freedom of speech, or things like kiddie porn or other stuff like that, like how to make bomb videos, whether or not that is speech or that's just criminal or that kind of thing. So people were very supportive, generally speaking, of freedom of speech, which is good, I suppose. A lot of people put it down as being did I miss? Let me just make sure I didn't misdo that, because that seems really low for. I think I miscolored this. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a professional. Did I miscolor this? I'm going to have to go back and look at this, because I could have sworn this was different. I'm going to have to go back and double check this. I'm pretty sure I did this right, but I feel like tied to property rights and set by the owner is too high on this. I feel like I might have confused the two of them. Let me just pull up the study and make sure I see here. Okay, yeah, I screwed this up. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. Don't worry, I'm a professional. This is supposed to be freedom of speech is generally a good thing, but there are limits. I just messed up on the labeling here. So I'll just make a note of that, and I'll go back and fix that after this is done. Okay, so really, really sorry about that. That just sometimes happens when you're making graphs. So generally speaking, libertarians were like, freedom of speech is awesome. Freedom of speech is like the greatest thing ever. So they were very much on board with it. A lot of people also said it's generally speaking a good thing, but there are limits. And then kind of the third largest category were the people who said that freedom of speech is a means to an end, not an end in itself. So that the idea behind that is there are people who support it when they're not in power, but if they were to ever gain power, then they would take it away from their political adversaries. So interestingly, as you can see here, this kind of cynical approach to freedom of speech was a lot higher among third position. Which is unsurprising because fascists traditionally are less for freedom of speech. So are traditionalists. But conservatives and libertarians are overwhelmingly supportive of it. Now, what's interesting... what's interesting is an unexpectedly high number of libertarians put freedom of speech is tied to property rights. Well, I guess that's expected. So there's a fair number of people who said that. Okay, so I see what I did here wrong. This is supposed to be, there are limits, so I'll fix that later on. Once again, sorry about this. I mucked up the labeling on this. So generally speaking, Christians are somewhat less pro-freedom. Christians are kind of in the middle. Pagans are very pro-freedom of speech. Agnostic and atheists, unsurprisingly, are very pro-freedom of speech. I don't know if it really meaningfully differs that much across the board. Protestants take a stronger opinion on that, but I think that's tied to Protestants being more politically conservative than they are third position. Okay, so death penalty. This was one I was not expecting nearly as extreme a response to as what I wound up getting. So, with regards to capital punishment, in which cases would you say it's permissible in? So I went through a couple different... Once again, some people complained about this, but what are you going to do? This is, generally speaking, when I looked it up, the tiers different countries have for capital punishment. So the top one is, of course, is exceptional cases. Serial killers, terrorists, traitors, the worst of the worst. People who commit the most horrible crimes possible. So the second case in which people will sometimes use the death penalty is any case involving homicide. Generally speaking, second or first degree. In some countries, only first degree. So that's normally number 2, a life for a life. Then we have the above and for other serious crimes. So I just put in like some of the worst things I could think of: rape, child molestation, drug trafficking. And then the above and for all other major crimes, including theft, major fraud, armed robbery, etc. So more than 3/4 of people want the capital... Or no, let me see here. Fewer than 1 in 10 are against use of the death penalty. Like half of people want it in most serious circumstances. So this is interesting. This is not a controversial issue in these circles. People are overwhelmingly supportive of this. Like really, really highly supportive of this. I was not expecting it to nearly be this high. So conservatives were slightly less in favor of its broader application. Third positionists were the most in favor of it, unsurprisingly. Interesting. Very interesting. So let's go on. Death penalty by religion. Interestingly, the Catholics were not having it. Despite what the Pope says, burn those guys. Bring back witch trials. Bring back stonings. Bring back burning alive. So Catholics supported it, Protestants supported it, Orthodox supported it. Neo-pagans were like the most pro-death penalty, but generally speaking, with the exception, generally speaking across the board, it was pretty much in favor of it. Okay, interracial relationships. So this was one I knew I was going to get some kickback for. So first category, okay regardless of the other person's race. Then okay with members of some races but not others. That's because in a lot of cases you have people who are like, okay, it's okay if you have an Asian girl, but not an African. So that was mainly the reason I put it in there, because that's a big thing. That was kind of like a big thing on the alt-right. Excuse me. Then we had only okay with members of the same race, only okay with members of the same ethnic group, and then we had the sleaze category, as I like to call it. It depends whether or not you intend to get married and or have children. So about 1 in 10 said, look, if you're just having an Asian chick on the side, but you're not going to have kids with her, then that's okay. Now, of course, libertarians were the most pro race mixing. Conservatives were also somewhat undecided. Obviously, fascists were the most against, with over half. I think this indicates a pretty strong sense of white identity, is how I'd imagine this being. But it's interesting because there was a number of people who have messaged me or posted that they're mixed race themselves, but they're kind of against it because they think it does lead to identity issues. So, interesting. Now, by religion, I think this one is not surprising at all. Pagan and neo-pagan. Like everybody. At least they're consistent. At least there's not a whole bunch of this bar. At least there's also not a whole bunch of this bar. So Catholics were so Christians were generally speaking kind of mixed on it across the board. Kind of the real standouts are secular people who are okay with it and pagans who are not having any of it. I think that's pretty funny. Septius7 says it does. I'm mixed race. It sucks. I don't mean to say that. Like, I'm not saying anything mean about them. I'm not saying that they're not people or they're lesser people or they're worth less in God's eyes. I'm just saying that's what people have said to me. And you can accept that or not. That's just what people have told me. Okay, so sex between consenting adults. This is another interesting one. I was very curious to see the results of this. So, sex between consenting adults is acceptable and or moral in all or almost all cases, even if the couple is unmarried. So, yeah. Hookup culture, like getting on Tinder, getting on Grindr. Yeah. Then we have acceptable and or moral only in the context of a committed relationship. So that means that, like, their boyfriend and girlfriend. By the way, once again, I'm not trying to be that guy. For those of you who are like mixed race or non-white, I don't have anything against you. That's what people have said to me over the years. I have a lot of friends of people from diverse backgrounds, and I mean that literally. I don't mean that to be a Dems are the real racist kind of thing. So in the context of a committed relationship, so that's if the people are like they're at like boyfriend and girlfriend. They actually have like an emotional connection. There's actually some romance between them. They're not just random people at a club. Now, I'm in the third category personally, but I think for most people, and you can see this there is, even if you're like a Catholic or you hold that position, there's a very big difference between being in a relationship and not being in a relationship. So then the third one, acceptable or moral only between a married couple. And then you have the Catholic position, acceptable and or moral only between a married couple, provided that no form of birth control is used. So this was another interesting. Once again, the trads are overwhelmingly with the last one, because most of them are Catholic. It's a bit higher than I thought it would be among all groups, but that was, I think, just because there was so many Catholics taking this survey. But generally speaking, aside from libertarians, most people don't like random sex. It's hookup culture. It appears is widely disliked. It's not really like a controversial issue. Casual sex is not liked in these circles, which I think is yeah. Sex between consenting adults. So then we have the religious breakdown, and this is where we got all of the birth control people are from Orthodox and mainly Catholic. Pagans are the least interested in marriage out of any group. Oh no, after agnostic or atheist. But pagans are like they're okay the most. They're okay, more so with casual sex, and they're okay with common law. I guess just the institution of marriage isn't that important to them in comparison. But generally speaking, most people required at least there to be some sort of a emotional bond between these people. So that's interesting once again. It's good to see a variety. I wonder if people got confused by this question and they took it to mean like a married couple would be in a committed relationship. Yeah. Okay, divorce. Divorce should be available upon request, available only in specific situations, abuse, adultery, abandonment. Divorce is never permissible. So, libertarians by far were an outlier. About half of them said divorce is okay in any situation. We have traditionalists were the most anti-divorced, unsurprisingly. Generally speaking, though, the consensus seems to be that that divorce needs to be restricted, which is generally speaking my position. I'm not trying not to spend too much time talking about my position on these things, but I think they should just annul marriages that end in abuse or adultery, but maybe keep the kids legitimized. So by marriage, Catholics were by far the most against divorce in all situations. Like there's a really big gap here between the different groups. Now, some Catholics I talked to said they support civil divorce. It depends how you interpret it, because some people thought religiously, some people thought civilly. I deliberately left it ambiguous. So we have, let's see here. pagans and atheists were the most in favor of no-fault divorce, but it's not super high. Once again, people like to shit on Protestants, but they weren't like significantly more pro unlimited divorce than were Catholics or Orthodox. So generally speaking, people don't really like divorce in these circles. At least that's how I would interpret this. Maybe I should have added more positions in, but to me, those are kind of like the three main ones. Okay, pornography. It's time for this survey to get absurdly based. Pornography between depicting consenting adults should be completely legal to produce and distribute. Legal to be produced or distribute but not publicly displayed. Illegal to produce and distribute but legal for private consumption, which is actually what I selected. Illegal to produce, distribute, or possess for private consumption. So 2/3 of people want to ban pornography, which is based. So people do not like it at all. And once again, this is something that a lot of people, I think, have been confused about, because there's some people in these circles who have defended porn. There's some people a lot of people have condemned it, but it's not a controversial issue at all. What I'm reading by this. Awakened from the Matrix asks, what about interethnic mixing within the same race? That was one of the categories. That a lot of people supported that, particularly fascist or third positionists, because white identity is basically what that is. So I'm surprised the number of people who like want to actively prosecute people who possess it for personal reasons. Once again, libertarians are the outliers, with nearly half of them wanting it to be completely unrestricted. Traditionalists are like radically anti-porn. So the most anti-pornography group by far is Catholics, but in general, other Christians were not having it. Generally speaking, regardless of religious group, most people want it restricted, at least to some degree. Pagans were actually very against it, which is a little bit surprising. Agnostics or atheists were more supportive of it than were the other groups. But generally speaking, Christians were like, no. Versus evolution. With regards to the creationism versus evolution debate, which position is closest to your own? So this was once again kind of a weird question, but I thought it would be interesting to ask, so I went ahead and I did it. So we have the vast majority of people saying theistic evolution, so some form of a mixture of both God and evolution, that kind of thing. So that tended to be the largest one. Let me just bring up global warming on my hand. So about a third of people believed in global warming. No, sorry. About half of people believed that global warming was real, that it was either currently happening because of humans or nature or both, and about the other half thought that global warming was exaggerated. So maybe I'll edit in an addendum or something to this afterwards. I'm sorry. Okay, so creationism versus evolutionism. Libertarians were by far the most in favor of atheistic evolution. Traditionalists the most against it. Creationism versus evolution. Once again, paganism or neo-paganism was like 50% atheistic evolution. which is very interesting. Not unsurprising, but interesting nonetheless. Protestants, actually, the Orthodox were the most pro young Earth creationism. Uh, it's interesting. Okay, so healthcare. Let's talk about healthcare now. So there's this traditional association in the West with right wing people, for whatever reason, are considered to be anti public health care. And what we found with this was a clear majority of people, over 50%, want some sort of public healthcare system. So we have conservatives are kind of in the middle. So let's just talk about the categories. We have single payer, social health insurance. Social health insurance is what they have in Germany. I'm not going to go through and you should have put a question in about what we think the role of each of the sexes is in society. That would have been a real base meter. I had that in the last one, whether or not women should be allowed to go to higher education or serve in the army. So yeah, we have okay. So then we have private healthcare with needs-based subsidies, so poor people get additional stuff. Basic public coverage with the option of additional stuff like that. Let's see here. Then we have a completely private healthcare system. Okay. So unsurprisingly, libertarians wanted private healthcare. Most people, though, tended to want some sort of mixture. That seemed to be the biggest category. People seem to think that basic public, like catastrophic or I guess kind of major surgeries covered, but sorry, I'm getting a little tired. Yeah, previous yeah, so people tended to want that. Fascists in particular, I get that their position is other stuff, but they were unsurprisingly the most pro single payer healthcare. A lot of them also liked social health insurance, which was actually something instituted in National Socialist Germany that continues on to this day because it works so well. And then, yeah, libertarians were the only one who wanted a public healthcare system, a private healthcare system. So pagans were the most in favor of single payer healthcare, which is interesting. But once again, it's this kind of so many of them put some form of fascism down. But for most people, in particular Christians, people seem to want a mix. Agnostics and atheists are also more pro single payer. But I think there's a pretty strong feeling here that there should kind of be a mixture of both, public and private. Something to that effect. Firearm ownership. So this one was a really difficult question to come up with. By the way, I apologize for whatever errors. As soon as I'm done this, I'm going to go through and repost things. Sorry, these things happen. So we had a couple different categories. We had, with regards to law-abiding citizens, firearms should be legal without restriction, legal but with a ban on certain types of weapons, automatic, assault, etc. Only long guns should be legal. That's kind of a thing in Canada. Possession of firearms should not be legal at all. So, unsurprisingly, libertarians want everyone to own machine guns and nuclear missiles and M1 Abrams battle tanks. Third position, and the other people tend to have a bit more of a mixed opinion on it, but everybody likes guns. Everybody wants to keep the guns legal, which is interesting. Let's see here. By religious group, it doesn't vary a ton. Pagans tend to be the most pro-God, though, which is once again kind of fascinating. Okay, cannabis legalization. This is a very topical because recently it became fully legal in Canada. So we have kind of the different ways people have decided to try to deal with it across the world. So we have fully legal, decriminalized but not legal, legal for medical purposes, illegal but not enforced, and illegal and enforced. So people did not like pot. Um, Only about a third of people wanted it to be legal. Another kind of 13% said, there's not really much we can do about it, but we don't want it being sold in corner stores. But a lot of people really didn't like it. Over half don't want it widely consumed, which is interesting. Of course, libertarians are once again the outlier. Third positionists and trads were the most anti-pot. Uh, Whereas conservatives and broadly right wing were a bit more mixed. Probably because there is some other stuff like that. Okay, then we have by religion, and Catholics really don't like pot. That's hilarious. Catholics want to take away your porn and your weed. It's the religion of no fun. Whereas, once again, Protestants, probably because they're more libertarian or conservative, tend to be more in favor of it. Agnostics and atheists are unsurprisingly strongly in favor of it. Pagans are somewhere in the middle. So that's interesting. Okay, transhumanism. So this one's going to be interesting to look at. So let's take a peek at this. So overall, most people took the perspective that some form of transhumanism is okay, so long as it's regulated. In particular, a lot of people were okay with it in the use of medical situations. So yeah, traditionalists, generally speaking, hated it. Keep in mind, 38%. Like what I mean by the second group is stuff like prosthetics. Like they're developing those new prosthetics now that you can control the limb using your mind. So like you can physically make your hand open and hand close just by thinking it. So stuff like that, maybe like we'll get bionic eyes eventually. I think they're working on that sort of thing. So people are more okay with that. Libertarians were, of course, the most in favor of transhumanism, with over half of them actively supporting it. A lot of people, though, had kind of mixed opinions on it, with trads being the most against. So let's take a look at religion. Now, this doesn't vary like a ton, but Catholics are the most against transhumanism, whereas obviously agnostics and atheists are the most in favor of it. So not a ton to say here. I'm just going to move on. Okay, so mental illness. We're at the second to last slide. So 30% of all people suffered from anxiety, depression. Then we have ADHD. Then we have autism. So the most mentally stable people were conservatives and libertarians, interestingly enough, with traditionalists also being similar. People who identified themselves as some sort of special snowflake and those who were like neat socks tended to be more mentally unstable. Let's see here. With regards to autism, it didn't really vary that much. I was hoping to get some memes out of this, but we didn't really have anyone who was that high in terms of autism. It would have been funny if libertarians would have been really high on substance abuse, but it just wasn't. So it turns out that Cat Gang is the most mentally stable group of people. Nearly 2/3 of them have not suffered from a mental illness. Um, the Orthodox are less mentally stable. Unsurprisingly, people who are like big time, like esoteric Evolicans didn't do particularly well in terms of mental stability. Pagans did decently well, although their anxiety depression was fairly high. So that's interesting. Let me see. Was autism like that high among anybody? Uh, I guess atheists, agnostics, esoteric people. It was a bit higher. But Catholic Gang did the best, I guess, is kind of what the outcome of this is. So then, that is the second annual political study. Now, does anybody have any questions? I'll stay around for a little bit. After I'm done this, I will correct the errors in the PowerPoint and tables, and I'll re-upload them. Once again, I'm very sorry about that, but in the words of the ancient Romans, it is what it is. Nothing I can do, but I digress. So anybody have any questions, stuff they wanted to ask me about, that sort of thing? Okay, I'll just give people a couple minutes to, if they want to ask anything or they have any thing they want to add. Otherwise, I've probably been going long enough. Third position is post-autism. That feel when spurred. Okay, so that's the kind of comments I'm getting at the moment. I'll give people another minute or two if they want to ask me anything. Will you be uploading the stream as a video? Yep, it will be saved as a video immediately after it's finished. So I think that's been going on long enough. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope everybody liked the study. That's about an hour and a half, so that's pretty good. Any plans for more surveys? Yes, I might do another one later on. Spark Schmidt says, I'm thinking of doing a survey of my own. Are you cool with that? Yeah, sure, go ahead. Go ahead, you're more than welcome to do one if you'd like it. Do you think the results were skewed by the places you shilled the survey at? Yes, it was. I mean, I know it was. That's why it's not a scientific survey. That's why I can't have a plus minus. I can't have a margin of error for this because of that thing. The total number of responses was 2181, but when I did the analysis, I did 2,095. So that is the study. I hope you guys enjoyed it. God bless everyone. Have a good weekend. This is Argent, and I'll talk to you all later.